There are at least two pairs of opponents in Kentaro Miura's Berserk who bring a sort of a destined to do this forever type of vibe to their adversarial relationships. The first one is obvious. Guts and Griffith are around a piece, and a grudge match between them is basically what Berserk has been building up to since the final third of the Golden Age arc. If you're even vaguely aware about what Berserk is all about, then you know why Guts hates Griffith and vice versa. But if you've only seen the anime versions of Miura's masterpiece, then you've missed out on the other eternal rivalry of Berserk. Skull Knight versus Nosferatu Zodd. The foe of the Inhumans and the Immortal One consider each other to be rivals of an equal peerage. No one can stand up to their might amongst humans or apostles, and they have fought each other on multiple occasions over the centuries. But there is a theory out there that says that somehow Zodd and Skull Knight might be related to each other beyond their adversarial relationship. This theory suggests that Skull Knight and his eternal rival are, in fact, two aspects of the same person, and that person died 1,000 years ago. But is there any merit to this theory? Let's break it all down as we investigate the mystery of, are Skull Knight and Nosferatu Zodd related? Before we get into our explanation, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The two swordsmen without peer amongst humans and inhumans. What is Skull Knight and Zodd's relationship portrayed as in Berserk? To put it as simply as we can, Skull Knight and Zodd are exactly what we called them in our intro, eternal rivals. Zodd showed up in Berserk before Skull Knight did, but the latter's debut actually reminded Guts of the Immortal One for a quick second, which was probably our first hint that these guys have history in hindsight. In chapter 37, where Skull Knight first shows up in his badass skeleton armor and his majestic steed, Guts initially mistakes his presence with Zodd's. He thinks to himself that the bloodlust he feels coming off of the wandering wraith is unmistakably similar to Zodd's presence, but it's not the same. He freezes up, much like he did in his encounter with the Immortal One, but when Guts goes to swing at Skull Knight, he misses. He's baffled by the thought of misreading his enemy's movements, something he has never done before, and that's when the foe of the Inhumans takes form from the shadows and gives Guts a warning that's pretty similar to what Zodd said, but once again, not the same. Skull Knight calls Guts a struggler and warns him that the eclipse will take place in a year's time. When it does, he will be faced by a torrent of madness and death that the human body itself cannot escape. This bit is pretty similar to Zodd's prophecy to Guts at the end of their first fight. Zodd told the swordsman that if he can be said to be a true friend of Griffith's, then when the White Falcon's ambition collapses, an inescapable death will pay a visit to him. But this is where their ominous foreshadowing diverges. Zodd claims that Guts and the Band of the Falcon will be unable to escape the eclipse, whereas Skull Knight tells his fellow struggler that because he was born near death's door, he excels at escaping it time and time again. The wandering wraith charges Guts with struggling, wriggling, and contending until his last breath, because that is the sword of one who faces death, and he better not forget this. But then, privately, he muses under his breath, in the abyss of despair, only he who stands up with broken sword in hand. Then he says, perhaps, and disappears into the shadows that he materialized from. This confused Guts to no end, and us when we were reading the manga initially. But then, when we got to the eclipse, we realized that Skull Knight's parting words could have actually been another prophecy. It seems extremely convenient that in the end, when all was said and done, Guts was the only man left standing in the interstice of Griffith's eclipse, and he had a broken sword in his hand. Skull Knight has been able to discern the flow of causality to a certain extent, so it's possible that he knew Guts had the potential to join him as a struggler that tries to face the absolute pinnacle of demonkind, the God Hand. This would explain why he showed up to save Rickert from the apostles that attacked Casca's reserve forces, because he also foresaw that young man's involvement in this grand plan that causality had woven. But this recruitment/rescue mission is also where we are made privy to the fact that the two coolest enigmas of the series to this day, Zodd and Skull Knight, are not only aware of each other, they also share an adversarial relationship. Chapter 80 opens with a shot of the eclipse from outside the interstice as Rickert makes his way to the designated rendezvous point and ends up seeing the guy who saved him face off against the guy who gave them a taste of hell at a two-door fortress over a year ago. From Rickert's POV, it's obviously confusing to see these two guys face off against each other because the only connection between them we've seen so far in the series is through Guts, who himself is perpetually confused about what all these prophecies being given to him actually mean. That's why it's so satisfying when the POV shifts to the two infernal beings gearing up for a duel, and Zodd is the one who first acknowledges their relationship. He's not surprised to see the Skull Knight arrive here at the eclipse. In fact, He expected it. The Wandering Wraith had been their enemy for 1,000 years, and so Zodd figured he wouldn't let this chance slip by him. Skull Knight retorts by guessing that he'd been assigned gate duty in anticipation of his arrival, but Zodd rejects the notion and informs him that he has no interest in the feasting aspect of the eclipse. What he seeks are the strong, and Skull Knight should know that because they're old rivals. The foe of the Inhumans says that Void would claim even this encounter is a part of Causality's grand plan, but if that's the case, then he would simply wager himself upon his sword. We don't actually get to see the Skull Knight and Zodd duke it out, and we still haven't, 372 chapters into the story, but we do know that the former has the latter's number on speed dial. That's because Skull Knight managed to easily outmaneuver the Immortal One, relieve him of his left arm, and break into the eclipse, leaving with Guts and Casca in tow, but not before taking a parting potshot in Void's direction. Zodd reattaches his arm and shows up for more action. He doesn't want Skull Knight to think that what just happened settles anything, but to his surprise, his adversary asks him to delay the battle. Zodd goes to call him out for it, but then he sees why Skull Knight has made that request. Guts had survived the eclipse. Zodd, extremely amused by the fact that the swordsman managed to escape his prophecy, agrees to Skull Knight's request and even tells him to get a move on, as the rest of the apostles would soon come spilling out of the interstice and want a piece of Guts and Casca. SK complies and gallops off into the night with Guts, Casca, and Rickert as his unwanted passengers, as Zodd relishes the thought of witnessing Guts' bloody peregrination as the branded swordsman. This first encounter between Zodd and Skull Knight tells us everything we need to know about their relationship. They've fought each other in the past and consider each other to be equal rivals. They respect one another enough to pause a battle and even help the other person escape before things get worse so they can fight again at a later time. And Skull Knight and Zodd are probably the strongest members of their respective teams, if you can even call Skull Knight a member of Guts' team in the first place. And argument can be made that other apostles in Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon are stronger than Zodd, especially Locus and Grunbeld, but we don't think that's true, and you can fight us in the comments all you want. Despite clearly being on opposing sides of the battlefield, so to speak, Skull Knight and Zodd continue to have this kind of mutual respect for one another outside of their rivalry. When they meet up outside of St. Albion before the incarnation ceremony, the supposed eternal rivals don't start leveling the very ground itself. They instead walk towards the Tower of Conviction together, where Skull Knight points out Griffith's rebirth to Guts, and Zodd makes his way to Griffith to become his first soldier in the world to come. When the Falcon of Light ordered his war demons to take out Flora, Zodd personally told his henchmen to not go after Skull Knight because, number one, they couldn't handle him, and number two, he was Zodd's rival in the first place. And that's pretty much the attitude they have towards each other. Whenever they see each other on the battlefield, they are compelled to face one another, and Zodd even thinks to himself that there really is no one who can stand up to him other than the wretched Skull Knight. As one of the mightiest apostles ever created with the heart of a warrior, Zodd doesn't seek to fulfill his baser demonic instincts. What he seeks is the ultimate strong opponent against whom he can test his full strength. In his 300 years of slaughter, he has gone up against both humans and apostles numerous times, but only Skull Knight has ever fit his criteria of strength. That is, of course, before Griffith shows up in metaphysical falcon form and slices off Zodd's left horn to literally beat him into subjugation. The only thing that changes after Zodd becomes Griffith's right arm of doom is that he now has a clear master looming over his head, which isn't much of a change either when you consider Zodd is probably one of the most loyal apostles the God Hand has. He was carrying out their will by sparing Guts and especially Griffith because he saw the latter's crimson behelit. He even killed Weil, a fellow apostle, when he tried to go against the God Hand's design because being subservient to a God Hand was hardwired into an apostle's physiology. So really, the only difference between Zodd's pre-incarnation ceremony and post-incarnation ceremony is that the strings pulling him are now visible in the physical world. Skull Knight is still one of the only people Zodd thinks of as a true equal in terms of fighting ability at least. So where does all this Zodd and Skull Knight are the same person speculation come from? Well, as always, it comes from the detail. The Skull Knight equals Zodd theory's basis. Most proponents of the SK equals Zodd theory hone in on the details of their characterization to make their point, so let's look into those. For starters, it is odd that both Skull Knight and Zodd seem to be entirely willing to let those not involved in their fight escape unharmed. Skull Knight did it to the apostles that ambushed Rickert's contingent, and then Zodd did it to Guts' party in Vertanis, because his actual objective was to take down Ganishka, not the Black Swordsman. Zodd and Skull Knight share similar views on on strength and duty, and that kind of thing can happen if you've been fighting someone for literal centuries, or if you're supposedly a negative reflection of your eternal rival. See, the main detail that makes this theory have any kind of basis is a couple of panels from chapter 53, which depict Supreme King Geiseric's armor as having Zodd-like motifs. When Princess Charlotte breaks down Midland's history for Guts' party, we see two shots of King Geiseric in his full armor. The second shot shows a close-up of his face covered in his infamous skull helmet, but the first one focuses only on the detailing of his armor. One of these curious details is what looks like a lion's head at the crest of the skull helmet. This feature becomes more prominent in the second panel we mentioned a moment ago, and the reason this is important is because Zodd's released form sees him turn into a massive winged black lion. What's more is that Geiseric's full armor and Zodd's battle armor that he uses in his human form are pretty similar in their detail. Zodd wears furry tribal battle armor with demonic motifs, whereas Geiseric's armor seems more elaborate and detailed. But the underlying design similarities are undeniable. And then there is also the fact that Zodd has seemingly seen Skull Knight fight in the Berserker armor, which should be impossible because Skull Knight's Geiseric days ended 1,000 years ago when Void was birthed, and Zodd is said to have only been an apostle for 300 years. In chapter 226, after seeing the Black Swordsman dispatch of numerous apostles in savage fashion, Zodd appears to reminisce over the appearance of the Berserker armor and asks Skull Knight if he wishes for Guts to follow the same path he took to hell. On the surface, this seems to imply that Zodd had fought Skull Knight when he used to be Geiseric, but that cannot be, unless they're the same person. If you take everything we've said about the similarities between Zodd and Skull Knight's movements, warning Guts about the eclipse, being interested in his growth as a struggler, being willing to prioritize only themselves over anyone else present in their vicinity, having lion motifs in their characterizations allegedly, it feels like they're two halves of the same entity, Supreme King Geiseric. The SK equals Zodd theory claims, in very simple terms, that somehow, at the moment of Geiseric's death, his soul was split in twain. The good side became Skull Knight, and the bad side ended up as Zodd. If you take everything we've said so far and add this thought into it, it can end up making sense to you as well. And while we don't deny that Zodd and Skull Knight are related to one another, the connection between them is not some 1,000-year-old blood feud between two halves of the same soul. If you ask us, there is really only one thing connecting Skull Knight and Nosferatu Zodd's ultimate fate in the story: Guts. How Zodd and Skull Knight are connected to Guts' story as a struggler against fate. Sure, Zodd and Skull Knight's actions and speech are pretty similar, but as we've mentioned before in this video, similar is not the same. Zodd predicted that Guts would be swallowed whole by the torrent that is the eclipse, whereas Skull Knight at least showed more faith in the lad's ability to contend. And we think that that is exactly where Skull Knight and Zodd become truly connected or related to one another, through their observations of Guts' fate. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. It is impossible for Zodd and Skull Knight to have been the same person because their existence has a 700-year gap between them, which simply cannot be ignored. Skull Knight, aka Geiserich, died and became a wraith occupying an armor created by the dwarf Hanar 1,000 years ago, whereas Zodd only became an apostle 300 years ago. That's not just the story telling us this. Even Zodd's inner monologue acknowledges 300 years as being his lifetime as an apostle, so off the bat that distinguishes them from one another. One can argue that maybe Zodd lived somewhere like Elfhelm where time flew differently before becoming an apostle, because Guru Gedfring is still alive and remembers Skull Knight from his Geiseric days. But this is unlikely, mainly because we're 99% sure Zodd was a warrior in his human life as well. Apostles who are able to resist their baser instincts and function on higher objectives like Zodd tend to retain their human goals even after reincarnation, and so Zodd might have been looking for the ultimate strong opponent even as a man, let alone after getting the powers of an apostle. And we also think that Zodd reminiscing about the Berserker armor during its first appearance has been misunderstood. If you look at the dialogue carefully, this is what Zodd says. "Ah, the memories, my dear old rival. So you would have him follow you down the same path into hell." The wording suggests that Zodd has fought Skull Knight in the Berserker armor, but as we've just established, that cannot be. It's more likely that Zodd, who is aware of Skull Knight's past as King Geiseric, was prompting a response from his enemy in the heat of the battle by forcing him to recall his memories of his days as a Berserker. So why do we say that Guts is how Zodd and Skull Knight are related? Well, that's because of their interest in him, and their interactions with him represent the two paths Guts' character could go on at any given time. In chapter 48, we learn that during his year-long mountain training at Godot's cabin, Guts had realized that his purpose in life would be to test himself against stronger opponents and see how he fared. The way of the sword is what he has known his entire life. so he embraces it and the challenge of stronger opponents as his new dream. If that sounds familiar, we think it's because this parallel between Guts and Zodd is intentional. The difference though is that while Guts would usually show his enemies some quarter if he could afford to, Zodd is entirely merciless. Guts becomes more like the Immortal One during his Black Swordsman days behaviorally, but motivationally, he feels more like Skull Knight. Guts might be consumed by vengeance and malice, and that might have been necessary for his survival in Berserk's cruel world, but his ultimate goal is not to just take out Griffith, but the entire God Hand. He's been killing apostles like Zodd for over 2 years by the time we catch up with him in the Conviction arc, and in those years, he is the spitting image of Skull Knight, whose only known motive is the destruction of the Inhumans. So where exactly do these two things intersect in his character? Well, they intersect at something Guts has been carrying around since the Black Swordsman arc, and that's his Behelit. So far, no one knows how Guts' Behelit is going to come into play in the story, and we think that's why it defines his connection to both Zodd and Skull Knight. A Behelit only presents itself to one with the potential of joining the ranks of demonkind. Though Guts has explicitly been rejected as being capable of that ascension by the God Hand, Slan is still of the opinion that he can do so if he just uses his Behelit. As of this moment, we don't actually know who the Behelit belongs to because Guts got it from the slug count, but its ownership seems to be divided between him and Puck. It is interesting to note that the Skull Knight has not taken Guts' Behelit to add to his Sword of Actuation so far, despite literally acting as a Behelit disposal unit whenever he showed up in the aftermath of one of Guts' battles. The Black Swordsman's current life as a struggler is pretty similar to the Skull Knight's previous life as Geiserik and current life as a wandering wraith. So how does all of this figure into Zodd and Skull Knight's relationship? We like to think of them as the scales from which Guts' character metric is being measured. Up until this point in the story, he's been tipping towards the Skull Knight's side of things. He's been battling Inhumans and fighting the good fight as best he can. But now that he's truly in the depths of his despair, will his scales tip towards the Zodd side of things? The Beast Swordsman and the Wandering Wraith are personifications of Guts' inner malice and outer duty, in our opinion. You take Zodd's ideal of strength and mix it with Skull Knight's hatred for demonkind, and you get Guts. And this is the only way that Skull Knight and Zodd are related to each other beyond their centuries-long rivalry. It's possible that Zodd first came across Skull Knight at the Eclipse before Griffith's, as that would have taken place in the first century of his own time as an apostle. Since he can discern the flow of causality, Zodd might have gotten a sneak peek at Skull Knight's past. Or maybe Void was feeling more chatty than preachy one day and decided to fill him in on the details of how he became a God Hand himself. Whatever the scenario might be under which they first encountered each other, what matters now is what they represent in the current story, and that is the two paths straight to hell for Guts. You gotta remember that as a branded individual, Guts is promised to the abyss regardless. His struggle only lasts as long as his body does. The question now becomes, does he do what Skull Knight did and get his soul to somehow keep existing within an admittedly badass armor made by an equally badass dwarf, or does he give in to his human despair at losing Casca once again and literally become the thing that he hates? We've been told that Guts has not been ordained by the laws of causality to join the ranks of demonkind, but Guts has shown a blatant disregard for fate and such things his entire life, and it has worked out in his favor so far. The connection between Skull Knight and Zodd is actually a representation of the two paths Guts could end up taking, and any kind of relationship between them beyond that is something we're going to have to wait for the manga to tell us. Marvelous verdict. But for now, that's gonna have to be it. Skull Knight and Zodd are undoubtedly two of the coolest characters in Berserk, period. Their rivalry and their enigmatic histories make them such compelling characters that you don't want to see them fight. You just want to know more about why they're fighting in the first place. That's not to say we don't want Studio Gaga to actually give us a proper Skull Knight versus Zodd battle before Berserk ends, but you get our point. And if you don't, let us know what you think about this topic in the comments down below. But for now, we'll bid you adieu, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the next one.